Hi again, I'm Dr. Kevin Orieux. I'm the CEO of Aararat Consulting, and welcome to part 2 of our series that describes why there's so much angst and antagonism and even adversarial mindsets between baby boomers and millennials. Having watched the first video, you know that we're actually quite sympathetic to millennials, because in our first video called Star Wars, we were talking about how although millennials may come across in a way that many baby boomers or anyone in management might find frustrating, aggravating, irritating, in our first video, we started to explain some of the sociological and psychological reasons why this angst between the generations exists. If you've seen any of the other videos from our website or on our YouTube channel, you may have watched a video called The Medical Parallels with Management, and that's what Aararat Consulting does. We're a consulting company that teaches management, executives, and CEOs how to get your people to get along, to work together for a common purpose towards a vision. And when we get our people healthy, then our people will be more productive. And when our people are more productive, then the company is more prosperous. But at Aararat Consulting, we say that there is a 3-tier priority system that, especially in the 21st century, everyone in management or every owner of a company must understand. This 3-tier priority system goes like this. People must come first. You have to get your people healthy first, because if your people aren't healthy, they can't do the second thing, which is be productive. And if we're not productive, then our prosperity suffers. And in medicine, we say, if the body is suffering, the body has disease. At Aararat Consulting, we draw that medical parallel to the corporate world by saying that when your corporate body is suffering, it's because there's some sort of sociological and/or psychological dis-ease. And at Aararat Consulting, we take a medical approach to help anyone who is supervising, overseeing, managing people. We help you understand people. Because all too often, as a throwback to the 20th century, this 3-tier priority system is done backwards. What it used to be in the 20th century was profits is the only thing that's important. And if we want more profits, then we have to bump up productivity. In the 80s, they called it lean and mean. And our people are expendable. Our people are almost like pawns, peons, if you want to call it that, to help us be productive so we can be more profitable. In the 21st century, for a number of different sociological and psychological reasons, that management model has to be turned around. People are the most important asset we've got. If we don't get our people working together in alignment for a common vision, we'll never be productive, and we will not be as prosperous as we could be and as we should be. So let's start looking at some of the problems that exist with people. Specifically, one of the biggest problems that everyone's aware of is this angst intergenerationally between millennials and baby boomers. We discussed a number of different factors, sociological and psychological, as to why this angst exists in our first video. Today we're going to deal with one of those factors, and we're going to delve into it. We're going to dig deep. So in medicine, when we're trying to diagnose why someone has a disease, we have to be able to look beyond the obvious. Well, that sounds obvious, doesn't it? Let me explain to you what beyond the obvious looks like. If a patient comes to me and says, Dr. Orieux, my head's congested and I can see that they've got a runny nose and they're sneezing in front of me and their eyes are all swollen. Well, you know what? If it was winter, I might come to the snap conclusion, snap diagnosis, well, they've got a cold because it's the cold season. And the first question I might ask is, did you get a flu shot? And the patient's going to say, no, I didn't. Well, then I know, don't I? That's what happens in corporate management. We hear a few tiny little tidbits, a few secrets and soft skills, and we think we know how to diagnose what problems are, but we don't, because we don't take a thorough medical approach. A thorough medical approach would include asking this patient a number of other questions to dig deeper. A thorough approach would include doing some tests. And you know what we might find out? That patient in front of us with the runny nose, who's sneezing, and the swollen eyes, when we start to ask questions, we find out that there's been a change in their environmental dynamic, we call it. In other words, they've just moved in with their significant other because they're in a new love relationship, but their significant other has a cat. And what we find out is that our patient is allergic to cats. Same principle here. Everybody knows about millennials. Everybody knows how these millennials, they have this sense of entitlement, they're self-indulgent, they're arrogant, they're lazy, sometimes just clueless. We've all heard this. At Aararat Consulting, we don't think that's a fair illustration. We don't think that's a fair way of looking at millennials. Because as we said in our first video, we can't paint them all with the same brush. I have a number of millennials in my companies, and we train them, don't get me wrong, but we have a number of millennials that are great workers. They're great listeners. They want to succeed. They want to be trained and mentored. And we've had a number of people that we've interviewed and some that we've hired that are arrogant. They do seem like they know everything. They don't listen to instruction. Those people don't last with us very long. We provide them with training. If they don't respond to the training, well, we let them seek happiness elsewhere. But we're going to talk about the good baby boomers and the good millennials. Because the good baby boomers, the good millennials will want to work together. But in order to work together, we have to understand each other's perspective. And in our first video, we talked about the perspective of baby boomers versus the perspective of millennials and how those perspectives are different. One of the perspectives, the one we want to talk about today, is how we respond to authority. And what we talked about for the baby boomers is that the baby boomers were raised with sociological conditioning to what was always the traditional hierarchy you would find in the military. And in the military, instructions come from the top down. It comes from generals to colonels to captains to sergeants to platoon officers, and ultimately it gets to what we call the rank and file, which is your basic soldiers, your privates, and your corporals. The corporate world is the same. We have all these different levels of authority. But when baby boomers were raised, they were raised by parents who had lived through the Second World War. So as we talk about war, I'm going to give you some interesting statistics. In the first half of the 20th century, we had two world wars. I'm sure you all know that. The First World War from 1914 to 1918, and then the Second World War, which was from 1939 to 1945. But what's an interesting statistic is that there were other world conflicts before that. There was the Boer War between the entire British Empire and effectively the Dutch, who had colonized South Africa. There was the Boxer Rebellion, and the Boxer Rebellion was an alliance of several countries, the United States, the British Empire, the French, the Italians, and they went to war against the Chinese. There was the American Civil War, started in Cuba, when Cuba was trying to get independence from Spain, and a U.S. warship was sunk in Havana Harbor. That led to this American-Spanish War, and that spread to the Philippines, which the Philippines was also under Spanish colonial rule. And because of those wars, that's how the United States has the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico, a lot of other Pacific islands. The point of the matter is, the world has traditionally, historically been at war almost forever, except for the last 70 years, and millennials were raised during that time of peace. Now, when I talk about peace or relative peace for the last 7 years, I want to be very careful to communicate something here. I want to be very careful that we understand that after the Second World War, there was the Korean War, there was the Vietnam War, we had the Persian Gulf War, we still have the war on terrorism that's being fought in the Middle East. I come from a military background. I was raised on a military base on the West Coast. We had nuclear weapons stored there. In other words, during the 60s, when I was a little boy, we were very much aware that Russia could send intercontinental missiles to where we lived to destroy our base. That was the Cold War. But when I say we've lived in relative peace, what I mean by that is that there hasn't been a worldwide conflict that threatened our domestic security, our domestic safety, and our domestic freedom, like the Second World War and the First World War. So millennials have been raised in an era where they didn't go rushing off to sign up to fight against the other side, the evil other side, which is exactly what my father did at 19 years of age in 1939, and he went overseas to the European theater, and he was there for the entire duration of the war. When I say we are not under attack domestically, our freedoms are not being threatened, that was not the reality of my grandfather or my wife's grandfather, who fought in the First World War, and they signed up as young men, only to experience the horrors of war. War is horrible, and yet it's because of the courage and bravery of service people, especially in today's society, who voluntarily go to ensure our freedom, our safety, and our security. So when I talk about 70 years of relative peace, remember, I'm talking about on the home front. Millennials have been raised where there hasn't been a threat on the home front. But that was not the reality for the parents of baby boomers, not the baby boomers themselves, the parents of baby boomers. The parents of baby boomers experienced a world war. Their parents experienced a world war. And before that, there was the Boer War and the Spanish-American War and the Boxer Rebellion. The world has been at war. But after 1945, in our domestic society, we have experienced relative peace for the last 70 years. And when you live in a time of peace, it affects your psychological mindset and it affects you sociologically because, as Aararat discusses, we deal with the science of psychology and sociology. When you're raised in a time of peace, then you become sociologically conditioned to the safety and the security and the lack of personal threat. That's what millennials have been raised in. So let's go back to statistics about war for just a moment. In the First World War, there were 16 million military casualties, and there was 22 million civilian casualties. 38 million people died in what was called the Great War. In the Second World War, the numbers were much higher. In the Second World War, military personnel, 22 million deaths. Civilian deaths, 53 million, for a total of 75 million. When you add those two numbers together, it's 113 million people died in a space of approximately 30 years. Well, what's the significance of that? The significance is, in 1945, when World War II ended, the world's population was 2.3 billion people. But everybody alive in 1945, every young adult, older adult, even teenagers, had lost a loved one. Why? Because 113 million deaths represents 1 in 20 people on the globe. In other words, post-World War II, everybody was aware of the ravages of war. And post-World War II, everybody had experienced war. And everybody knew that sociologically, there was a hierarchy of authority. Because if you had served during the war, you knew how to take orders from those in higher ranks. Why did you learn to do that? Because if you didn't, and you were my father at 19 years of age, very easily you could die. We all want to live. Self-preservation is one of the strongest human instincts. So, if you were a 19, 20, 21-year-old and suddenly you were at war, you learned to listen to superior officers, or they didn't have to be officers, just someone of a higher rank with more experience. Well, let's think about that in the workforce. Millennials are like the new recruits. We actually call them recruits. Do they listen to those that have more authority? Are they attentive to those with more experience? No, what we hear about millennials is they enter the workforce and they think they have all the answers. That's why they've been accused of being arrogant or know-it-alls. And let's face it, technologically speaking, they know a lot. And they know a lot more than me. I mean, I'm a baby boomer. I'm 57 years old. I don't know anywhere near as much about technology. I need my daughters to show me how to use my smartphone. But it doesn't mean I'm not their father, and it doesn't mean I'm not an authority figure in their lives. Same thing happens in the workforce. You bring on young recruits, and you bring them on because they have this know-how, because they can use this software, because they know their way around hardware. Yes, that's wonderful. It's one of the reasons that we want to have youth, because they know things and they've learned things that are cutting edge that maybe we don't know. But it doesn't change that the older generation is in the position of authority because we have raised through the ranks, to stick with this military example, and we have the experience. And we want the younger people to listen to that experience because we're trying to help them. But it's kind of hard to deal with young new recruits if they think they don't need to listen. And that's one of the complaints about millennials. See, millennials, having been raised in a relative time of peace, don't understand how to respond to this hierarchy of authority. But I knew how to respond because my dad lived under that military authority, and my grandfather lived under that military authority, and my great-grandfather lived under that military authority. So in the family dynamic, it was pretty clear. During the day, the authority figure at home was my mother. If my mother said, do this or do that, if I was a wise young lad, I would listen to her. But sometimes, whether I was being a little bit arrogant or rebellious or thought I knew a better way, sometimes I would defy authority. I would defy my mother. I would be defiant, which is the way that so many millennials are viewed. That they're rude, they're arrogant, they're defiant. But if I was so naive, you might call it stupid, to defy my mother's authority, she knew how to bump it up to the next rank. And any of you that are baby boomers have heard this parenting phrase. My mother would say, young man, if you don't do this right now, well then you can wait till your father gets home. And I did not want to mess with the 5-star general in our household. So I took that sociological conditioning that all baby boomers had, because all baby boomers are raised by parents who had lived through a world war. We understood authority. We understood the hierarchy. We understood how to say, sir, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. We respected authority because we've been sociologically conditioned to respect authority. And psychologically, we are imprinted to understand authority. And that has not happened with millennials. And the reason it hasn't happened with millennials is because their parents my generation came up with a new philosophy, a new parenting model, a new paradigm. And we came up with this new way of thinking because, relatively speaking, society was at peace.